Okay, so the three of us are very happily here. Charlotte Cotton, curator, writer, Melinda Gibson, photographer and bookmaker, and me, Lucy Moore, owner of Claire de Rouen books. So we're here to have a conversation about Melinda's book, The Photograph as Contemporary Art, and perhaps you want to just introduce it briefly.
Yeah, of course. I think probably everyone's quite aware of the title is exactly the same as Charlotte's book, and the project came out of a very odd lecture that I had back at university, and it's kind of the project was based around the kind of canonisation of photography and kind of the authorship and kind of the questions that I kind of wanted to explore around kind of contemporary art photography, I guess. So I produced a set of collages that came directly from Charlotte's book, which were the pages taken directly out of them, and then I recontextualised the images exactly,
yeah.
And then recontextualised them in a trio together to form kind of new, unique works. This book is a kind of a result of that, which is nearly a 2-year project in the making, where basically it's a kind of the final full circle of the project where I removed the images from Charlotte's book and I've now put them into my own.
Great. And Charlotte, when was the book published originally?
The Photograph as Contemporary Art was originally published in 2004, and I wrote it towards the end of 2003. Very condensed period, and but it's had a second edition, and now I've just written the third edition of the book.
Great. Melinda, when did you sort of finish studying? Were you studying at the time that the book was first published?
It was. I studied just as you brought the book out. So I studied in 2003, and so in 2006 I graduated. So at that point, our first kind of contextual studies lecture was we were given your book to read and to really look through and to kind of really kind of analyse.
Do you remember what you thought?
I remember being really confused, actually. We were given this book, and like every kind of student at the point, it's like, we must go and get the book we want. And so we went through them, and I remember everyone kind of was a bit like, wow, this is kind of going over my head a little bit. And then we had a kind of a tutor who Susan Pry actually. And she kind of did a whole lecture around canonisation, and basically you brought your book in and said, let's have a look at this. So kind of from then it always kind of resonated with me quite high.
So perhaps, what strikes me there is that maybe this canonisation or whatever it was very fleeting. If you think about the publication of your book, for example, and the kind of situation that we're in now, with Melinda's project being an obvious example, but certainly a sense that for me, definitely in the bookshop, that there's a kind of multiplicity of photographic eyes and voices making, very much without too much of a sense of hierarchy. Although I guess this is, Charlotte, the Photograph as Contemporary Art maybe kind of set this landscape for understanding the relationship between photography and art.
Yes.
Or photography's relationship with that kind of framework.
Yes.
As a way to understand its production. And that you're certainly operating within that. And do you feel is this project in some way a way of kind of I guess I was really interested in the physicality of it, that you're kind of quite in a sense using a technique that's not strictly speaking very photographic, but more collage based kind of art practice of negotiating this kind of knowledge that's been set up in your own through a physical kind of process, and thereby sort of exploring a relationship to that.
I think absolutely. I think a lot of it's about kind of having a kind of an independent relationship to a book like that, and that's something which I originally kind of talked about when I thought about your book. Was I felt that when you're kind of given, and actually not like a lot of textbooks in that kind of academic way, there's kind of you have a relationship to it, but it often feels that there's always a little bit, almost a bit too much of a gap between it.
Yeah.
I've always felt that there's this kind of emptiness that much as you try to kind of penetrate it, you actually can't unless you physically kind of really involve yourself into it. And for me, that actual physical act of cutting something or pulling something apart was my way of really kind of diving into this piece of information that I couldn't maybe naturally kind of digest in kind of an academic way, but in a more kind of fluid way I did by kind of delving in, pulling bits out, removing bits of text, moving bits of paper, moving bits of the image, where you actually, for me, start to get a kind of a much kind of deeper understanding of it than just kind of, really kind of shallowly looking and just turning over a page.
Yeah. Because, Aaron Shimon in his little forward talks about how it's as if you managed to capture stills from a dream the night before a big exam. on photography.
It's amazing.
I mean, maybe deeper, but also more subjective and also playful, right? In a way. I mean, they feel very.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things. I mean, for me, like,
almost.
There needed to be like a kind of, I felt there needed to be like a playfulness about it. There needed to be kind of like, we've spoken about before, there's kind of these contradictions within kind of art photography and kind of visually and conceptually, and kind of, there needs to be kind of like a lifting of kind of a physical lifting of something, like one, removing it from a page, but also kind of seeing you do kind of play around with like what people know, what people understand, what you also understood to be kind of within all the context of all these things as well. So I hoped it would be kind of quite playful in its kind of actually pulling bits out and putting them somewhere else, and also that it's also kind of quite juvenile in a way, and it's very simple in the terms of where when you're a child and you cut something out and you stick a head on something and you're like, what does that look like? And I think that's actually really important because it really breaks down the kind of the context of everything, because you really are bringing it back to the simple forms of this bit goes there and that bit goes there.
Yeah, and I think it actually builds up visually a very convincing argument to say that there are kind of these sort of meta tropes within contemporary art photography, and my selection, which was done, as I say in the essay, like primarily visually, there are actually these consistencies, and you can break it down to almost very simple picture forms that determine contemporary art photography.
That's really striking, isn't it? Because you do see again and again, the silhouette of a figure.
Yes.
Quite, with a sort of
straight on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very much so.
And the horizon is another.
Yes.
Very much expected, I guess. Trope.
Yep.
But what about, I'm interested. You worked for Wolfgang Tillmans for some time, who is, I feel, I guess, certainly is the strongest sort of photographer working in as an artist alive, probably. And so, how do you think that sort of how do you negotiate that relationship? Is that important for you now? Or?
Yeah, very important. I mean, I worked for him for a very short amount of time, and I was kind of brought in kind of strangely, to help him digitally. But of course, working with him was for your own practice, and just working in an environment with that was incredibly inspiring. He's an incredible man, an amazing artist. And what he does is very truthful and very honest, and it kind of made me, I guess what always kind of drove me with him was the fact that he always did what he wanted to do, but it was a very kind of gentle, but very strong way, which I kind of really liked that. Kind of that connection he had. He was kind of really strong on what he wanted to say, but there was a really beautiful tenderness to the way he kind of treated everything, and the way he held paper was amazing, and the kind of those kind of like a sensitivity to the medium, which I think I find very inspiring.
And how's it sort of affect? I mean, do you feel sort of in a sense closer to Charlotte's practice as a curator in a way, doing this like I sort of heard you saying that maybe you might start working with archives.
Yes.
And so what do you think of this role of, because there's an argument, many artists now talk about editing and curating as a form of creativity that's perhaps much easier to negotiate than trying to make an original image, for example, now. So do you
I mean, it's just beyond doubt. I mean, that's probably the biggest shift that's happened since the early 2000s, when we were still preoccupied with the idea of authorship being about the authorship of a body of work, with a authored photographic element. And I mean, even in, I think, the best undergraduate courses now, even if you're training to be contemporary art photographer, you do so as a publisher, as a self-publisher, and as an editor and a curator. So it's not that those things didn't go on before, but I think that in part because the early 2000s was still the kind of tail end of quite a defensive argument for why photography was a legitimate art form. There wasn't really that space or capacity to talk about these many different active processes in the life of a creative artist. So in one way, I think the photograph as contemporary art and what Melinda has done is actually kind of push it into what I think is really the step that isn't really in that book, even though, of course, I tried very hard for it not to be about an academic legitimisation of photography. It was really about what I thought motivated these people, what I felt were their interested. So I suppose I tweak a little bit the word academic. I think it's a really intelligent book, but it's not geared towards academia. It's really about... It's in the World of Art series, which is the book you pick up when you're really desperate to know a subject very, very quickly. Exactly. So it's written in that way, even if it feels like an insurmountable amount of information at first reading.
Exactly.
And what are there photographers in the book who you particularly relate to? I mean, I guess I'm really intrigued by, how it very much, in some sense, evaporates a chronology or a set of hierarchies, and so I'm wondering whether there are some photographers who you feel particularly
I have to
indebted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that of course there's going to be, because just kind of how you're trained and how you'll naturally kind of go towards certain photographers. I mean, it's kind of strange. I mean, everyone would probably imagine that Martin Parr's picture would be in the selection that I had, but there's none of it in there. And there's a few photographers that I work with, or I have a personal relationship with, whose work is in there. And I actually thought it's really important, which is probably what when you were putting it together, to kind of really kind of disregard all those kind of relationships that you have, to bring it back to something really, really formal and really simple about just kind of the visual structure of an image and how you put it together. So, I mean, I've never really been like, this particular photographer is someone that I really admire, or in terms of I want to be like, or they really influenced me other than Wolfgang. I think, but there's definitely a kind of autobiographical element to it, because obviously I've dissected it in a way which is very personal to me, because it's the images that kind of affect me and how I, in my day-to-day life, or what I've seen or what I've been taught, which may be different to other people's. So I guess in that, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess another thing that sort of has always struck me about the concept of appropriation is that, in one sense it's about kind of retrieving a kind of sense of, retrieving a sense of power over knowledge or imagery, but also, or maybe problematizing a kind of authority that something a book or an image might have, but that. Again, but with that gesture, a kind of appropriative gesture, you also acknowledge the ease with which that gesture can be made, and therefore you kind of accept that we're all on a kind of equal playing field in a way, and that there perhaps isn't too much of a hierarchy going on. Like, so, you have appropriated Charlotte's book, but I could equally decide, I will do something to your book. And so there's a kind of, I'm sort of interested, I mean, I was talking about Eggleston just 20 minutes ago or so, and thinking about how, having seen his new room at the Tate, those images feel actually so exceptionally kind of singular and brilliant to me. And I'm just wondering whether you either of you sort of feel like that moment has, well, it has shifted. I think, you know, we're not in that kind of photographers aren't kind of working in that realm now. So what do you think is? I mean, for example, talking about maybe the Deutschboss, you know, just like you have someone like Mishka Henner and Brunberg and Channerin who are working with existing imagery, and Christina de Medel, and then you have Chris Killick. It's kind of coming from a very different position. Do you feel that reflects any?
I mean, I suppose there is a good conversation to be had about where we think appropriation is.
Yeah.
I mean, on a personal level, I don't think appropriation as a term has really stayed in the same place. It may even be debatable about whether that is an appropriate term anymore, and whether, you know, something like pirating or kind of the use of the way that we use orphan images, or how everything becomes orphan in this particular moment, allows us a certain license, and also means the act of using somebody else's images, known or unknown, is possibly a less politicised act. I think appropriation at that kind of traditional sort of 70s, 80s definition would be one which is often about correcting, the artist as the corrector of ideologies, through the appropriation of images. So it's the control of the images is the big issue. I think that story is somewhat different now. I'd like to introduce something else, which was the writing of David Joselit, who's written the book After Art, and he has made a really good case for why this sense of there being so many images and all images being orphaned and this kind of raw material that anyone can create a new form from isn't actually a phenomena that's just of the 21st century and in digital culture. In fact, if you look at, obviously, the other big moment when collage and montage was important within artistic practice in the early 20th century, that was in direct relation to the rise of photomechanical reproductions. So again, another period of seeing, unimaginable quantity of images. And that feeling that we have today, that somehow it's this sort of out of control sense of just there are more images than people, actually emotionally and in a creative sense is aligns us actually with earlier periods of artistic practice, but potentially with this depoliticised element to it.
Yeah, definitely seems definitely less kind of politicised than it ever was before. Because I mean, for me, like kind of inspirationally, I've always been kind of very drawn to kind of the Dadaists, and obviously that's highly politicised, and you know they were, and that was, like you said, directly against kind of that kind of digital influx of that everyone could take a photograph, and there was so much around, and so it's kind of really interesting for me to be in a kind of position in my own time to have to feel like I'm kind of like slightly suffocated by all these images, and kind of have this, and like you said, that raw material that you kind of can use, or that you maybe you should be using, that people, you know, for me I think, you know, it's in my practice to kind of use this material in a different way.
What about, can you talk about maybe what led you to the work you were making before and the work you're going to make now after?
Okay.
And how that, you know, in terms of, I guess, saying that it's been an inspirational kind of project. I mean, has it got more longevity? You know, is it going? What are your? Maybe you talk about the future.
Well, kind of the point you made earlier, which is kind of actually something which I thought about quite a lot about this book, is obviously I kind of appropriated Charlotte's book, and I'm really looking forward to the point where someone does something with this, and I almost feel like there's this kind of, it's a continuing relationship. Kind of my relationship to Charlotte's book made me produce a body of work, and then I would hope that someone else's relationship to what I've done would create like the journey to kind of carry on. So I'm kind of excited about the possibility of definitely this kind of continuing journey where people use different things, and there is like a level of inspiration for it. And I think for me, definitely this actually right now I think is probably the kind of the finish ending point for me of this project, which is amazing. But I'm really pleased about where it would take the journey for somebody else. It's almost like it's kind of, Charlotte I feel like, you know, that you gave me something that I needed to do, and then I've given it to this, and then it will do what it needs to do. But in terms of my practice, it definitely is really inspiration for me, because it's made me think about things in a kind of a different way, and a kind of deconstructing something, which is which I've done always, but I've definitely it's such a long process, this whole, I mean, I started it in 2009, so it's 2013, so it's a long process. So it definitely has led me to think more about working with kind of archives, and more work with kind of found imagery, and actually not work so in isolation about it, because I've worked, you know, I had your book, I sat by myself, it was very kind of quiet and just about me and my relationship. But actually now my practice is moving where I'm working with collaborators, with other archives that they are bringing me in to work with. So it's definitely it's definitely moving my practice in a way which I never thought was possible, and is incredible.